Hello and welcome to the introductory lecture in the GeoCurrents series on global demography. The title of the series is Population Explosion or Birth Dearth, Understanding Global Demography. Today I'll talk a little bit about the main debate, that pitting pro-natalists, those who think the birth rate over the world and in the United States ought to increase, versus anti-natalists who think that the birth rate, whether across the globe or in the United States, should decrease. So I'll briefly outline that debate. I'll go into more detail about it in the second lecture, and I'll also talk a lot about global demographic patterns and trends currently in 2025. Begin by saying in our age of rampant polarization, there seem to be few issues that are more polarizing than that of population. My graphic here, borrowed from the internet, shows an American view of Republicans versus Democrats. And I did that on purpose with the Republicans on the pro-natalist side. Not all Republicans are, but generally the movement is more associated with Republicans, and anti-natalism is more associated with Democrats. And I also say this is a very polarizing topic from personal experience because in extended family gatherings over the last couple of years, it has been the topic of the most heated discussions. In fact, last summer I had to sort of step in, intercede to try to calm tempers, and things were getting a bit heated. It's a very interesting debate because those on the two poles basically agree about the facts of the matter. They also agree that the situation is extremely dire, but for exactly the opposite reasons. So anti-natalists argue that overpopulation is threatening the planet and risking human extinction, and therefore that birth rates must be reduced, whereas pro-natalists think that the current fertility collapse over most of the world is threatening humanity and risking human extinction, and that therefore birth rates must be increased. In this class, I will strive to remain as neutral as possible. I will try to give a good faith presentation of the positions put forward by both sides, focusing mostly, though, on giving information as accurate as I possibly can. So anyway, on one side, we have groups like Population Connection, formerly called Zero Population Growth, as well as most other major environmental organizations that are concerned that birth rates are too high. The illustration I have here comes from a letter that I received from Population Connection. I came home from winter break to California to find two fat envelopes from this organization in my mail. I get them regularly, even though I have never given them any money. But as you can see, the rhetoric is fairly heated. You can stop this madness, the madness being overpopulation threatening our living planet. And you can act now. And basically what they want is they're soliciting funds to help invest in programs to reduce the birth rate. Now, what are the facts of the matter? Well, it is true that the global population is increasing by a large number every day. I asked ChatGPT, not that I consider it an oracle, but it's pretty good for this sort of thing. And the chatbot tells us that the Earth's human population is increasing by about 200 to 220,000 people per day, which is really quite a lot if you think about it. And this just comes from looking at birth rates, which are pretty accurately reported, and death rates, which again are not perfect, but they're pretty good. It is interesting, though, that in the same answer, they tell us that it's 200 to 220. They do the math and they get 225,000 people. This sort of population growth is not normal in human history. If you look at a graph showing global human population, estimated obviously, over the last 1,000 years, you could see that around 1750 there was an uptick, and then late 1800s really moving into exponential growth with that curve going almost straight up. And the current global population is over 8 billion, which is a vast number considering historical norms. In some parts of the world, Africa particularly, fertility rates remain very high as population growth is rapid. In this class, I will almost always use the metric of the total fertility rate, which is the most intuitive way to understand it. What the TFR is the hypothetical number of children that an average woman will give birth to over the course of her lifetime in a given area. There are other metrics like raw birth rate, where you simply have the number of births per a given unit of population. That's not as quite as intuitive for understanding. So I'll use TFR in almost all cases. So on the map of Africa here, you can see there's only one country, Tunisia, with a total fertility rate of below 2, fewer than 2 children per woman on average. One, Morocco, that's about 2, and all others are above. And a number of countries, particularly in Central Africa, are well above, over 6 children per woman on average. And a total fertility rate of 6.5 would mean a doubling of the population in 17 to 25 years, depending on the mortality rate. Because of these high birth rates in Africa, most demographers think that the population of the continent will eventually approach and perhaps even overtake the population of Asia, which is by far the most populous continent in the world today. So we have, looking at these numbers, in 2020, Africa had about 1.3 billion versus 4.6 billion in Asia. But UN demographers predict in 75 years, they'll be pretty close to each other. Now, of course, we don't know what is going to happen over the next 75 years, and those numbers are almost certainly not going to be accurate. They're simply projections, but it is undeniable that Africa is increasing in population much more rapidly than any other part of the world. And another way to look at this is with population density maps. All I have to say, the early population density maps are guesswork, and the later ones here of these series of maps are projections. You can see that even in the current period, there are parts of Africa that are quite sparsely populated, the gray areas. Those are mostly desert or other areas that are difficult for people to inhabit. But you can just see the filling in of Africa's population. And the population of Africa in 1900 was about 140 million. Today, over 1.5 billion. And again, as we saw before, projected to be over 4 billion. If we take a particular country like the Democratic Republic of Congo, which I outlined on the previous map, we can get a little better understanding of what's going on. DR Congo is a very troubled country, not politically stable, a number of insurrections and rebel movements, a lot of ethnic conflict, and quite a weak government. Its current fertility rate is about 6 children per woman. Its current population is estimated, and this is a rougher estimation than we have for many countries, but about 111 million. In 2000, it was only 47 million. The country has had a very difficult economic and political times since then, but its population has more than doubled, and it's projected to reach over around 362 million by the end of the century. It's a very poor country, per capita GDP of about $650 per person, and about 3/4 of its people live on less than $2.15 a day. What the map shows, and this is a rough estimation though, are just deforestation hotspots. DR Congo sits, at least the northern half of the country, in one of the world's great tropical rainforest belts, the other being in the Amazon basin in South America, and the Southeast Asian archipelago, mostly in Indonesia, Malaysia, and New Guinea. This area has seen somewhat less deforestation than the others, but it is heating up, and habitat loss is increasing quite rapidly. And that's a basic issue too with Africa, is it still has some of the best wildlife habitat, particularly for large mammals in the world today, but that habitat is really shrinking fast as human population and livestock associated with people expands. Now, it is important to note that high fertility is not just an African issue. Let's look at Afghanistan in Central Asia, if you will. Current fertility rate about 4.3 children per woman. That's a lot less than DR Congo, but it's way above the replacement rate. Current population is about 43 million, whereas in 2000 it was about 20 million. In the intermediate period between those two numbers was a period of almost constant war in Afghanistan with some 150,000 war deaths or 170,000. That doesn't really do much to change population, though, because it's mostly young men dying, and with high fertility, they're quickly replaced. Also, Afghanistan saw a huge flow of immigrants in this period, about some 6 to 7 million people. So without that, its population today would be much greater than it is. And it's projected by the UN to reach almost 100 million. It's even poorer than DR Congo in terms of per capita GDP, $416 per person. Also, it's a place with a tremendous amount of environmental degradation. Drought is common. There's a lot of evidence that drought is intensifying due to global climate change, although there are debates about that. But it is a water-stressed country already. And those who are concerned about this look into the future and wonder how Afghanistan is going to maintain itself, considering its water resources, for example, with a population increasing the way it looks to do. Also, I'll note that emigration from Afghanistan is not necessarily a solution, because one might argue, though, well, it doesn't really matter how much the population grows, because people can migrate as they have been doing. But currently, Pakistan and Iran, the countries that have received the largest number of Afghan refugees and migrants, are currently deporting them back to the country. All over the world, there's a lot in increasing hostility to immigrants. That's not just true in Europe, United States, and Australia. It's also true in places like Iran, although a lot of that is specific to the issue of Afghan immigrants. Now, anti-natalists will readily admit that birth rates are declining. That's undeniable, and that they will probably eventually result in population reduction. But anti-natalists view population reduction as highly beneficial and think it should happen faster than it is currently happening. So here we have a Scientific American editorial arguing that population decline will change the world for the better, that it will offer increased opportunities, a healthier environment, certainly more room for wildlife. And just a quote from it, population decline is only a threat to an economy based on growth. Shifting to a model based on degrowth and equity alongside lower fertility rates will help fight climate change and increase wealth and well-being. The argument by pro-natalists is that declining birth rates will lead to economic decline, we'll all become poor. But anti-natalists will generally say, well, that depends on the kind of economy you have. Our economy has been based on growth. That is, in the long run, they argue, unsustainable because resource limitations will eventually put an end to that growth. And so we need to transition to a model where we don't have growth. In fact, we have a shrinking economy, but we also have redistribution from the wealthy to the poor to create human equity and well-being for all. That is the argument that they give. Well, let's look at the other side. As I said before, I'll go into these arguments in much more detail in the second lecture. But the pro-natalist side, we might say it's led by Elon Musk, although there are plenty of people in this camp, but he's the most influential, certainly the wealthiest. And you can see here a Newsweek article from last year with Musk issuing a warning, birth rate warning of mass extinction. And to quote from him, a fertility rate below 1.6, and I'll add the United States is at about 1.6. Anyway, means 50% fewer new people after 3 generations, say 100 years, below a birth rate of 1.2. That means an 80% drop. Yeah, the U.S. is at 1.64. China, Japan, Poland, Spain, all below 1.2. South Korea is at 1.7, which means a 96% drop, mass extinction numbers. And then Musk adds, if there aren't enough people for Earth, there definitely won't be enough for Mars. And, of course, Mars, the colonization of Mars is one of his main points of his agenda. And we have a photograph of him with his family. I believe he has 12 children. And I will note the quest for Mars is very serious. Donald Trump has recently announced a desire to plant the American flag on Mars. Quite debatable, though, whether going to Mars is feasible or would be beneficial. We can discuss that later. Anyway, global fertility will probably fall below the replacement level within a few years if it hasn't already. So ChatGPT tells us that the total fertility rate now for the world as a whole is somewhere between 2.25 and 2.41, using getting the 2.25 figure from the United Nations Population Fund and the 2.41 figure from macro trends. I did a blog post on GeoCurrents recently questioning macro trends data. I think some of it's quite problematic. UN United Nations Population Fund is a good source, although, as we'll see later, some people think it is putting those fertility rates higher than they actually are. So it may be that the fertility rate has already gone below the replacement level, and the replacement level is around 2.1. You might think it's 2.0, but it has to be a little bit higher due to child mortality of people before they reach the reproductive age. In poor countries, it could be as high as 2.5. In the ancient world, for example, in the Roman Empire, it was probably over 4. It might have been as high as 6. And I'll talk about that a lot when we get to the third lecture. It is very important to note that once the fertility rate goes below 2.1, that doesn't mean population growth comes to an end. Even regarding anything like immigration or emigration, population will continue to grow because there's a very important lag factor. So let's say you have a pretty high birth rate, so you have a lot of children, then the birth rate plummets. Those children are going to, of course, gradually age, and 20, 30 years, they'll be in their key reproductive period, so there'll be a lot of people in that cohort. And anyway, that will keep the population growth going. So it takes a generation or two for a fertility rate at the replacement level to result in population stabilization. So I've illustrated this with a population pyramid, or a series of them, for Japan. This has shows sex on the men on the left, women on the right of that central strip, and then just age cohorts. And so you can see Japan in 1950 with a lot of children, and then the birth rate goes down, and you have these bulges that move up. And then projected in 2050, a top-heavy pyramid with a lot more old people than young people, which is something that really concerns pro-natalists, as we will talk about. Global fertility rate has been dropping for decades. That is undeniable. So we see here from database Earth, which I find a pretty useful source for these kind of graphics, showing a total fertility rate for the world as a whole. And it's interesting, peaking around in early 1960, and then a pretty smooth decline, not entirely smooth, but a downward trend, a few inflection points. That's interesting. One around 2017, and that seems to be borne out by most of the data. Some would suggest this as associated with the mass adoption of smartphones across the world, although that is debatable. The United Nations expects eventual total fertility stabilization and convergence among different countries at a level a bit below the replacement level. So we can look at these projections where you have a number of countries and with quite different fertility rates, and then you look at how the UN projects it, and you can see them all converging quicker for the wealthy countries on the left, and then developing countries, well, South Korea is included there as too, a little bit slower to converge. But you can see it shows South Korea's very low fertility rates increasing, and actually several countries increasing. Well, who knows? I don't think really we can't. Well, it's useful to make the projections as long as we realize that's all they are. And in fact, UN projections have been underestimating the fertility decline. I have this Financial Times graphic here showing 3 extreme cases. This is not total fertility rate, but rather birth rate, a number of births you can see per 1,000 population. And you can have the actual number in red and then various UN projections. And UN projections have just completely missed this plummeting of birth rates in South Korea and in Colombia and Chile. A number of Latin American countries are not too far behind South Korea in this birth decline. There are whole regions of the world with very low fertility. This is a Wikipedia map showing birth rates in Eastern Asia. We have Japan, South Korea, North Korea, a little bit of China and Russia and Taiwan as well. You can see most of South Korea below 0.8. If you look closely, you could see Seoul and several other big cities in South Korea. Below 0.8. Almost all of the country below 1. Most of Taiwan below 1. Interesting, Japan was one of the first countries to go below the replacement level. It actually now has a relatively high fertility rate, at least relatively compared to South Korea and Taiwan. No place here is over replacement level. North Korea, close to 2.0 is close to replacement level, but isn't there. One other thing I would note about this map is it's, the data for China and Russia are not regionalized. They're just showing China and Russia as a whole. And if we do regionalize it, we'll see something like this. So northeastern China is actually down near the level of Seoul, and far eastern Russia, Vladivostok and environs, is about 1.4, so lower than the country as a whole. And for China as a whole, we can see here in northeastern China, Manchuria as it's generally called, these very, very low fertility rates below 0.79. Now, this data is perhaps questionable. It comes from an ex post called Birth Gauge, or from an organization called Birth Gauge. This is one of those sort of anonymous groups of people who actually get birth rate numbers, birth rate numbers in particular from countries, and then calculate total fertility rate on an updated basis. They generally have lower fertility figures, not always, but generally lower than the United Nations. I'm not sure how trustworthy they are, but it can be useful. So they gave data for China by province in 2023, and I simply mapped it out. An interesting pattern, the big cities here, Shanghai, Beijing, all extremely low fertility, as would be expected. That's generally true of large cities. Interesting to see these very low fertility rates also in the far north and northeast. That northeastern area, Manchuria, was 50, 70 years ago the wealthiest part of China. Certainly it was in the mid-20th century. It had been a Japanese colony. Japan actually built a lot of heavy industries there. It was the place in China that had the most industrial economy. Today it's a bit of a Rust Belt economy with not competitive heavy industry. It's seen a lot of economic decline. And that's often associated with low birth rates. But we also have richest parts of China, like Shanghai, the province of Jiangsu, also with these very low fertility rates. And then higher fertility rates in the interior, especially the interior south. These tend to be poorer parts of China, more non-Han Chinese people. For example, Tibet, still mostly Tibetan. Its birth rate is pretty close to 2 and is the highest in the country. There are some deep implications of a total fertility rate of 0.7, as I mentioned before with the quote from Elon Musk, but just asking ChatGPT, if we assume no migration and no change, population of 100 million after 84 years will be reduced to 12 million. South Korea is about 50 million today, so we're talking about a reduction down to about 6 million or so. But of course, these assumptions are questionable. Fertility rates don't stay the same. They're changing. They certainly could go up. Of course, they could go down again. Who knows? But this is the sort of just mathematics that really worries pro-natalists. In China, the country as a whole began to decline in population probably in 2021. Now, its birth rate had fallen below the replacement level much earlier, but remember there's a long lag factor. And so you could see here right around 2021, the death rate line and the birth rate line crossing. So the death rate has been going up, partly because the population is aging, birth rate coming down, they cross. And China has very little immigration. Because of cultural and economic and political factors, it does not attract it attracts very, very few immigrants, and that's unlikely to change, although potentially it could. India and China are the two demographic giants of the world, each with about 1.4 billion by conventional numbers. Interesting to look at the historical population for the earlier periods. This is mostly guesswork. That's one reason why those lines are pretty flat. But you can see India had more people than China in most of the late medieval and early modern period. China surges ahead. India now has surpassed China and will end up with quite a few more people than China, but China's population is coming down now, and India's is projected to start declining pretty soon. And that's because its total fertility rate is now below the replacement level. The UN puts it at 2.0, which is essentially at the replacement level. Database Earth has it at 1.94, but continuing to drop. It wasn't long ago that north central India, the most densely populated part of the country, the Ganges Valley, essentially, the historical core and political, cultural, and demographic terms, still had very relatively high birth rates. This was from data released in 2012. This came from a map that I made at the time, and I was very interested because you had this very distinct regional pattern with all of southern India below the replacement level, a few big states significantly below the replacement level, the far north also below replacement level, and then this much higher fertility band, state of Bihar, which you can see there in dark red at about 3.5, which is resulting in pretty rapid growth. I would note that Bihar is generally is the last in every socioeconomic indicator you can find in India. It has been the victim of high levels of political corruption, very socially conservative region, resistant to a lot of change, a real economic laggard, although there's some evidence now that it is starting to catch up. But anyway, let's look at the situation today. So I simply mapped out the most recent data I could find, which is quite recent, for total fertility rate in India by state, and we only have 5 states of India now above replacement level. Bihar is down to 3.0, but its neighbor to the west, the very densely populated and populous state of Uttar Pradesh, is now at 2.4. It's approaching a replacement level. If we actually take all these states and map them out, you can see that the north central part of the country still has a higher fertility rate than the rest of the country, but there's been sort of a convergence, converging at a figure of a little bit below the replacement level, essentially. Yeah. Or another way to look at this is to just look at the change. I just took the data from these two maps and put it together to see what's happened between 2012 and 2024. And it's interesting, the two southernmost states of Tamil Nadu and Kerala have seen a slight uptick in their fertility rate. I think it was from 1.7 to 1.8. Kerala in particular has the highest levels of social development in India, things like literacy and mortality and the like. It was the first Indian state to transition to low fertility. When I first started teaching world geography in the late 1980s, Kerala and the Sri Lanka, the island country, it's not labeled, were the only parts of South Asia that had relatively low fertility. Now it still has low fertility, well below replacement level, but it's I guess the point is that it looks like India is not moving into this hyper low fertility pattern that you have in much of East Asia, for example, or southern part of Europe. It seems to be converging at this level of below replacement, but not way below replacement fertility levels. If we take the same map and just add total fertility rates for neighboring countries, you can see Sri Lanka below replacement level, 1.9. Myanmar or Burma right at replacement level. Pakistan, on the other hand, still well above replacement level, similar to what it was in Bihar decade or so ago, and then in Afghanistan, significantly higher. There's a lot of concern about population in Pakistan. I'll talk about that a little bit later. What I want to mention now is the independent country of Bhutan, with a very low fertility rate of 1.4. The nearby Indian state of Sikkim, you can see it just right outside the box to the west, has a fertility rate of like 1.1. Interesting. In much of the Himalayan region, you've seen this real drop. The Indian, let's say, actually a union territory of Jammu and Kashmir and a union territory of Ladakh there in the far north of India, they're also in this very low position of 1.2 or below. Bhutan is interesting. Its current population is only about 786,000. It's a well-known country for its what many people think of very sort of enlightened social and economic policies. It got a lot of attention a decade or so ago by saying they were going to focus less on gross national product than in gross national happiness. They have actually greatly improved their gross national product, however. It's been doing fairly well economically, but it has this very low birth rate and it has a huge immigration rate. So there's a lot of concern in Bhutan that the population is emptying out. So here's a snippet from a video of why people are leaving Bhutan for Australia. Young people are fleeing the happy hermit kingdom in droves. A lot of this is what might be called chain migration. Some Bhutanese go to Australia. They get fairly good jobs. It's a fairly highly educated country, I should mention. So it's people are able to get pretty good jobs in a country like Australia, and then they'll tell their friends and family members, and others move out. So there are concerns in Bhutan about this. The situation with Pakistan and Bangladesh are very, comparing them is very interesting. I guess I should go back a couple of maps here. So we have Pakistan to the west of India, and then Bangladesh. You can't really see it with the boundaries. I suppose I should have put darker boundaries around Bangladesh. It kind of looks like an Indian state here, but it's an independent country. India kind of wraps around it. They were part of the same country after the independence of British India in 1947. British India was divided into two countries, India and Pakistan. And Pakistan at that time was a two-part country, West Pakistan, which is now Pakistan, and East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. They separated in, I believe that was 1970, a war between them, and Bangladesh became independent. But at the time, they had essentially the same population. You could see this graph here. We have Pakistan in green, Bangladesh in orange. Yellow is Nigeria, which is extraneous for the current conversation. But it's interesting to see how they start to diverge around 1990, with Pakistan continuing to go up in Bangladesh with the birth rate, at least the population growth rate, starting to level out. Bangladesh at this time started to do a lot with family planning, encouraging contraception, establishing family planning clinics in rural areas around the country. Pakistan was much more resistant. Bangladesh also started to do pretty well economically. When it became independent, it was often considered a basket case, a country that would never develop because it was so poor, so densely populated. It's almost all in the delta region of the Ganges and Brahmaputra rivers. It suffers periodic floods. Global warming is probably easily could be increasing flood potential. Also, sea level rise. Something the country is quite vulnerable to, so there was a lot of speculation that it was going to simply be a disaster. But it's actually done much better economically. It's a major center of textile exports these days. It was previously way behind Pakistan in terms of social development. It's caught up and surpassed Pakistan in many of those measurements. And you can see the population forecast with Bangladesh reaching population stabilization and in projection declining, in Pakistan eventually stabilizing, but with a vastly higher population. Another thing that's very important to note is that some middle income or developing countries have joined wealthy countries in the being in the situation of extremely low fertility or sort of hyper low fertility. So Thailand in Southeast Asia is a very interesting country to look at. You can see back in 1960, like almost all developing countries, it had a very high total fertility rate, well over 6, similar to what a country like Somalia or DR Congo is today, and then just a very smooth decline already before 1990, dropping below the replacement level, kind of stabilizing, and then dropping even lower. So the UN now puts it at about 1.3, so much lower than the United States, lower than Northern Europe, for example, similar to Japan, Italy, Spain, countries that are in this low fertility, but not as low as South Korea. But you know what? Maybe it is getting in that situation. So birth gauge, this X account that I've talked about before. Here's a post from June of last year where the author says, it's becoming ever more certain that the total fertility rate of China will drop below 1.0 children per woman this year. So if true, that's putting it in this sort of hyper low situation. And as mentioned before, other countries, Chile is a very good case. Database Earth, here you can see that it's putting its total fertility rate at 1.13. Interesting to see there was according to the data, a little uptick around 221 and then dropping again. And we go to birth gauge, and what do we say? Well, doing the math gives a total fertility rate of just 0.9 kids per woman in Chile this year. Should it continue to the end of the year? And all over Latin America, total fertility rates are collapsing. In some places more than others. But there is an increasing pace of fertility reduction in many countries. It's undeniable. This is an interesting graphic from Our World in Data. How long did it take for fertility to fall from more than 6 children per woman to fewer than 3? And so you can see in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, it took from 1815 to 1910. And then, we're going through other countries in descending order. In Iran, it occurred between 1986 and 1996. So much more rapid fertility declines are possible and are happening today than in the past. Current global fertility map of the world. I put a oval around the area very crudely of high fertility levels, which is basically Africa, particularly Africa south of the Sahara, but also extending into South Asia. Now, in that oval, there are a lot of low fertility countries in the Middle East and Southeastern Europe. But what I want to do is just sort of show that Africa and Central Asia and getting into part of South Asia, Pakistan in particular, have these higher fertility levels. You can see on this map, which comes from UN data 2024, a number of Latin American countries are shown above replacement level. Paraguay, Bolivia, Honduras, Guatemala, some Southeast Asian countries, Cambodia, Laos. This is uncertain. These countries may already be below replacement level. It depends on the sources you look at. But what I want to do is focus on Africa with that very high fertility rates. But it is important to note they are dropping there as well in essentially all countries. So we have, again, Database Earth, the total fertility rate of Somalia. Now, the graph is misleading because the bottom is cut off. As you can see, the bottom is 5.8, which is a very high total fertility rate. But the point is not that Somalia has a high fertility rate, but that it has dropped pretty significantly from as recently as 2000 at 7.5. So that's a pretty rapid drop, and you can see it in other African countries. Niger, total fertility rate below 6, and you can see that it wasn't that long ago when it was well over 7. A lot of concern about Niger. It's in what is known as the Sahel Belt, just south of the Sahara, where there are periodic devastating droughts. And so there's a lot of concern about how a country like Niger can support its population going forward unless those birth rates drop faster than they are dropping. One other important note about Africa, though, is it is the only continent today that's still mostly non-urban. Its urbanization rate is increasing. The world as a whole is now more urban than rural. We have a projection of urbanization in Africa, and you could see it's projected that sometime around 2035 it will become more urbanized, and the urbanization rate is projected to keep going up. And then I have a graph from the Democratic Republic of Congo comparing urban and rural birth rates. And you can see urban birth rates are still pretty high there, 4.2, but that's a lot less than the rural birth rate. Africa, one of the few places where even megacities like Kinshasa and DR Congo still have fairly high birth rates, but they are coming down. Central Asia is really interesting because it's seen a fertility rebound in recent years. So I've labeled several countries here. We have 5 right in the heart of Asia that were former Soviet republics: Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan, all Muslim majority countries. And then Mongolia between China and Russia, Tibetan Buddhist, historically speaking, a dominated country. Mongolia has been independent since 1912 or so, but it was essentially a Soviet satellite during the Cold War period. It's actually one of the things that led to the breakup of the Soviet Union was the fact that birth rates among the Muslim populations of Central Asia were so much higher than among the historically Christian populations of Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Georgia, and Armenia, which led a number of people to say, well, looking at the changes that are going to come, maybe it's better if the Soviet Union were to break up. So that's all very debatable. But it's really interesting looking at the birth rates in these countries. So let's take Mongolia. You can see back in 1970, very high birth rate, over 7, very rapid decrease. It's actually accelerating in the 90s, bottoming at around 2, going a little below replacement level, and then rebounding, going up to about 3, coming down a little bit in the last 3 years. Almost everywhere we've seen declines over the last 3 or 4 years. But its total fertility rate is 2.58 according to Database Earth. It may be higher. So it's interesting to ask why. So I try to do a little research to find some possible explanations. One is it is because Mongolia has elevated the status of motherhood. So here we have a more births post. Elevating the status of motherhood solves the low birth rates, the extraordinary case of Mongolia. And then the subtitle says, for 68 years, Mongolian leaders have given the order of maternal glory to mothers, raising the status. Well, they raised the status a long time ago, but yet the birth rate increase is more recent than that. So this becomes a bit questionable. I do wonder if it has something to do about concern about China. A lot of people in Mongolia feel their country faces an existential crisis, perhaps, being sort of squeezed between China to the south and Russia to the north, both countries of which have in different times, historical times, dominated the country. Mongolia with a very small population compared to Russia, and certainly compared to China. Important thing to note about Mongolia is that the country of Mongolia is only less than half of historical Mongolia. When the last Chinese dynasty, the Qing dynasty, collapsed, so-called Outer Mongolia became independent. Inner Mongolia remained part of China, became a Chinese autonomous region, given autonomy after the Communist Revolution to supposedly give cultural room to the non-Han Chinese Mongol, in this case, mostly Mongol residents. But these autonomous regions of China have pretty much lost their autonomy. This article from Time talks about Beijing's recent aggressive attempts to curb the Mongolian language and culture in Inner Mongolia. And a quotation here is Mongolia is fighting for its survival. So Mongols in Inner Mongolia are sort of at the risk of losing their culture. They are greatly outnumbered by Han Chinese today because there's been so much migration into the region. So if you look at the country of Mongolia, only has 3.5 million people, very sparsely populated given its very sizable extent. And then Inner Mongolia, Chinese so-called autonomous region, has 25 million people, but 80% are Han Chinese. Although the Mongols there, note, they're 4.2 million, so there are far more Mongols in Inner Mongolia than there are in the country of Mongolia. But anyway, this perhaps leads to a kind of, I don't know if you could say, patriotic desire to procreate, to maintain the Mongol culture, Mongolian population, and so on. Now, if you go back to 1250, Mongolia was the most powerful empire in the world under Genghis Khan and his successors. They certainly have a storied history, and there's a real concern about population decline and domination, particularly by Chinese. This explanation, however, would not work for Kyrgyzstan, a very mountainous, poor former Soviet republic, independent country since 1991. But you could see its fertility rate, bottomed out at about 2.5, right around 2000, then increased up to well over 3, has dropped down, according to the UN, down to 2.75, but there are some groups, particularly birth gauge, that say it's well over 3. So it's hard to know. So again, we see this rebound and then followed by a bit of a decline, but still relatively high. And a somewhat similar situation in neighboring countries, like Tajikistan, for example, Kazakhstan. Real exception, though, in the world is Israel, because it is the only developed, wealthy country with above replacement level fertility, and pretty significantly above. So you can see this graph here with the total fertility rate of Israel. Have the replacement level at 2.1 in dots, and you can see it did drop down to below 2.8, but it never came close to a replacement level. And after bottoming out, it increased again. And the last couple of years, it's dropped again, but it's still, certainly by the standards of developed countries, a very high level of fertility. And it's really interesting to see it break down by religion and religiosity. So I've taken the graph here and I put a red box showing numbers for Jewish women and Muslim women. You can see for Jewish women, the total fertility rate in Israel. I say this is Israel proper. This is not including Gaza or West Bank, but just the 1948 boundaries of Israel. The Jewish fertility rate is slightly higher than the Muslim fertility rate. But in both cases, the fertility rate drops by a degree of religiosity. So for Jewish people in Israel, for the Haredi, or sometimes called ultra-Orthodox, that they don't like that term, I tend to avoid it, it's over 6. And then for the non-ultra-Orthodox but highly religious, 3.7. The sort of traditional religious, 2.8. Traditional but not religious, 2.2, and then not religious at all, completely secular, which is a large proportion of the Israeli Jewish population, 1.9, below replacement level, but not much below. And then with Muslim women in Israel, very religious, 3.12, not so religious, 2.38. We'll see this later on in the course. In many areas, there is this correlation between religiosity, which has declined in most of the world. That's something that correlates with the birth rate drop, and total fertility rate. So in the United States, we'll see something very similar with Haredi Jews or Amish or Old Order Mennonite or Hutterite Christians with these very high birth rates. I did a blog post recently that might interest you on the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or Mormons, which used to have not a super high birth rate, but well above replacement level. But that has really changed in recent years. And the fertility rate of Utah now is well below replacement level, and there's been a convergence of Mormon and non-Mormon birth rates. Also, it's interesting to note in Israel, if you look at the Palestinian territories proper, West Bank and Gaza, you can see a really declining birth rate. It's now about a little over 3, pretty similar to that of Israel. So this is sometimes explained in terms of political conflict of two societies, Jewish and Palestinian Muslim, fighting over the same territory, in bitter conflict with each other, and both wanting to maintain their numbers, although in the face of pressures, various kinds, you've certainly seen a big fertility drop in the Palestinian population. But well, I suppose what I'm trying to say is one of the reasons why the Jewish population birth rate has remained relatively elevated in Israel is the sense of being in a nation that is in a struggle for survival and a need to maintain the population. So I'm almost done with today's lecture, but I do, last topic I want to take on is the accuracy of the information, because it's uncertain. And the sources I go to more often than not are the United Nations Population Fund, which I have long considered the gold standard, but I started looking at this birth gauge site and being very surprised at how different the numbers are. So just to give you an example, take the 2024 fertility rates from the UN Population Fund and then birth gauge. And in almost all cases, they're lower for birth gauge, but Kyrgyzstan and Central Asia an exception, after actually having it significantly higher. And the thing that really shocked me is the birth gauge claiming the Philippines has gone down to 1.3, which the United Nations has it at 2.7, and almost every other source puts it certainly at well over 2. So those were just sort of shocking numbers and just made me wonder about the whole thing. Now, also to note is that the author of the birth gauge does admit that the so-called tempo effect means that a lot of these figures may be lower than they will turn out in the end. And by the tempo effect, what that means is what happened when you have a cultural change where women were previously mostly giving birth in their 20s, the most fertile period, and then they delay childbirth to their 30s. And so you have a real sharp drop and then a bit of an uptick as women who did not give birth in their 20s do give birth in their 30s. And so this is pretty well known. It's especially true for wealthy countries. So here it gives numbers for standard total fertility rates and then tempo adjusted, pushing them upwards. So this is from 2023, but pushing the U.S. up from 1.6 to 1.8, still below replacement level. So this is something to take into account. Certainly for the United States and for Western Europe as well, Australia, many other countries, there has been this cultural shift to giving birth later. So here we have births by age group of mother in the U.S. Unfortunately, it only goes up to 2018. But you could see still at the top in green was so this age, late 20s, but you could see it declining. But then you can see a pretty significant increase in the early 30s. Quite a drop in the early 20s, which is the period of sort of maximum fertility or fecundity, a significant increase in the late 30s, plummeting in teen years. This is something that is very important and it hasn't got as much attention as it should have. Teen pregnancies and births in the United States really declined. And then also an uptick in the early 40s, which is a period when an awful lot of women have trouble conceiving. And it's often reported that, there is an issue with infertility as women delay childbearing a lot, end up in a situation where they're not able to have children. So this is important, but it's also important to note that this is not necessarily global. In fact, if you look at the Wikipedia here list of mean age of childbearing, the highest figures all have very, very low fertility. Hong Kong's not really a country, part of China, but largely partly autonomous. Bermuda's not a country either. But anyway, San Marino, a microstate, but countries with the highest average birth age, very low fertility. But the countries with the lowest ages of women, this is not first child birth, but this is just childbearing in general, all have low fertility as well. You can see Venezuela at the replacement level, Cuba, Nepal, Azerbaijan, Bangladesh also well below, and Bangladesh with the lowest age. The reason you get this sort of thing is countries with real high fertility, like those in Central Africa, women are bearing children over many years. They're starting relatively young, and they're having children through their 20s into their 30s, and that's when you get these very high birth rates. So it's an interesting question. Well, women in Bangladesh are having birth at relatively young ages. How is the birth rate so low? Well, one of the reasons is because of the preferred means of contraceptions, where in much of South Asia, Bangladesh, India, Nepal, there's an awful lot of voluntary sterilization. Women will have number of children they want, 1, 2, 3, and then will undergo sterilization. So that leads to a very sort of different dynamic. And you can see this here in an interesting graph showing not Bangladesh, but the neighboring Indian state of West Bengal. It's culturally quite similar, whereas Bangladesh is mostly Muslim, West Bengal is mostly Hindu. But they speak the same language, Bengali, have a very similar culture. And just to look at the comparing it to the United States, so both of these countries are below birth rate, below replacement level births, pretty similar birth rates. But you can see much earlier age in Bangladesh, and by the time you get to the late 30s, very, very few births, and then in the United States, quite a few births after that, whereas relatively few births teen period or early 20s. So that is the last slide from this lecture, and the next lecture, which I hope to post in a couple of days, I'm going to delve much more deeply into the debate. And I'll talk about the pro-natalist and the anti-natalist positions. And a lot of this is going to be sort of assertions, rejoinders, rejoinders to the rejoinders, sort of this back and forth dialogue. And again, I'll try to remain as neutral and as impartial and even as I can in explaining the debate. So thank you for listening, and I hope you can listen into further episodes of this series. They will be giving... there'll probably be something on the order of 16 lectures in this series. And I will also delve into historical patterns of demography. The third lecture, I will actually go back to the origin of humanity, up to the ancient world, and so on. So anyway, thanks again, and I hope you tune in.